Hey, welcome back to Bridal Sewing Techniques, and today we're going to talk about how to put in a mesh panel. We'll be putting it in two different ways, by hand sewing and then also by machine sewing. Let's start with the hand sewing. This is by far the easiest and most efficient, least expensive way of putting in a panel. We're going to first follow this outside line and then the inside line. So we will have 2 rows of hand stitching. Both rows will be stitched differently. So I'm going to show you how we'll do it. So we'll place the mesh piece in, making sure it's colored match to the bride's skin tone. And we're going to put in these nice long stitches, almost like a basting stitch, but it looks a little bit neater from the outside. So I call it coming up for air. The thread's only going to come up for air, just very tiny stitches. The length of the stitch, as you can tell, is happening between the layers. So I'm going to duck down and only stitch underneath that lining layer. I'm not grabbing any inner lining or the shell layer of the dress. So this stitch is pretty much going to float just on the lining. Now when I get down here, I'm going to turn the corner and we're going to have a nice kind of square-ish shape at the bottom here. So we're going to have some right angles until we get to the point that we need to travel back up the other side. And we're going to maintain the same method. Go for about 1/2 inch, come up for air, maybe 1/8 of an inch or less, and then do it again. Make sure you do not get too much tension on your stitch. Too much tension is going to give you a bad look. So we knot it off, hide the tail between the layers, snip. Now I'm going to compare because right now we can do some micro adjustments very easily. So I'm going to fold the dress down the middle and make sure that the top edges of this mesh are completely level with one another. I'm going to true up any little bit of that mesh that's not right. And if I need to, I would adjust it with a stitch. Now I'm going to knot this and I'm going to do a very tiny back stitch right along the edge. So my goal is to do it right at the manufacturer's understitching that they have going on, or between the understitching and the shell layer, which is that's a pretty small zone. So if you're not familiar with backstitching, on this channel, I don't like to throw out a lot of terminology without defining it, okay? Let me just explain that understitching is the stitching that you see along the edge of the seam that forms the boundary between the lining and the outer layer. So you can see that stitch right there by my thumb right now. That's the understitching. And it is critical for a garment to lay well. So a back stitch is basically the needle is going to move forward when you're between the layers. You pull the thread out and then you place the needle behind where that thread came out. So it's not the same thing as a running stitch where the stitches are one after the other, but rather you're going to go back behind your previous thread pull. It's a very strong stitch, very, very strong, very tight stitch. So we want to make sure that our stitching style is what is strong and tight and our thread is, but we don't want the tension of the thread to be too tight. That's a different thing. If the tension of your thread gets too tight, your mesh is going to gather. And as you can see, this is laying nice and flush, and we don't have a bunch of rumpling and gathering. Now let's look at this next example. You can see where this is pointing. This has been basted in, okay? So I want to first baste it in and have a fit check before we go through the process of machine sewing this sample in. As I said, the first example was the most simple form that you would have to do this mesh insert. This one, I purposely picked one of the most complex ways that you could do it. You can obviously see we're not dealing with straight lines at all. This mesh panel is being replaced because, as you can see, this dress has side seams, and to adjust the angle of the strap plus the size of the dress with the side seams, you have to essentially remake this mesh panel. So this is the reason why I thought it would be a great example of kind of your more complex situation. So on top of that, I'm also going to machine sew this mesh panel in. That way you can see worst case scenario, what would you face to be able to get this sewn in. Now, as you can tell, even just along the strap with it just basted, it's laying beautifully. So we're going to stick with the hand sewing method along the strap side of this mesh, but the mesh that is swooping along what would normally be considered the top back edge of the bodice and up to the side of the bust of the bodice, that part needs to be machine sewn in, as you can tell. So we have passed the fit check. I feel like this size mesh is just right. The way it's basted in is just right. We just need to go to the machine now. Here we go. Before I release the basting stitches, I'm taking note of the seam allowance of the mesh. I made it a 1/2 inch, and that's very prescribed. So if it was off by any bit, I would have trimmed it to make sure the seam allowance is perfectly even the whole length of it, because that's going to be my guide on the inside of the dress. I have a reason for stitching this large stitch with a very obvious color thread. That is going to be a little bit more wayfaring for me. I am removing the basting stitch now, and when I'm inside the dress sewing, I will know that the mesh is to have the 1/2 inch seam allowance and that the mesh will terminate right where that stitch is. So I made sure to make sure that stitch only goes through the lining layer, nothing else, so it doesn't interfere with me turning the dress wrong side out when I start sewing. So again, I'm releasing this basting stitch. Now I'm going to release this stitch that holds my layers together. That's my side seam that I'm crossing right now, just to help orient you. As you know, I am team razor all the way over here. I don't really use seam rippers. If you prefer seam rippers, go right ahead. It's whatever works best for you. I just find this to be a little more efficient, and I'm less likely to stab myself or the dress for that matter. All right, so now I'm going to take this mesh piece and I'm going to baste it to that inner seam allowance that we just released. And I'm going to go up that whole side, making sure I keep my seam allowance proper. These stitches don't have to be beautiful. They will never be seen. However, just like in other places, the tension of the stitch does have to be right. This extra little tail of fabric that we have in here is from where I had brought in the side seams of the dress. We're pretty much going to ignore them. I do want this alteration to be reversible someday, if ever that's needed, and it's really not causing a lot of bulk in there. Once we tack it down and press it, it'll be fine. So we are going to ignore it and go right across it. The main thing is checking to make sure that the mesh lays flat and smooth, the seam allowance stays correct, and that the mesh terminates where that stitch is at the top. I don't even need to knot this. Isn't that super cool? All right, so we have that basted in. Now let's go to the inside of the dress And we're going to lay that bodice edge, those seams together again, just like they were originally sewn. I'm going to first go ahead and just tack it together just to get things in place while I fully position the dress. And here we go, sewing down that seam, making sure we keep the mesh seam allowance to the right and the dress is to the left. Originally, there was a little tape of fabric that was in there along that seam that would just stabilize things and prevent any stretching or rolling. And you'll see that here in a minute, kind of floating around. The first time that I sew this seam, I do just ignore that tape of fabric. And when I come back through, there you can see it. When I come back through the second time, then I'm going to sew that down. It is important. Sometimes they put it in a dress and it's not all that necessary. And if it gets tattered and torn, you can just snip it out if the dress is strong enough. In this case, though, I think any little bit of effort we can put into it to give this mesh more stability is going to pay off. So I will definitely sew that piece back in. And I'm sewing down as far as I can go. The dress is constructed a little different at the bottom of that V where I can't do all machine sewing there, and you'll see that in a minute. And here I am sewing over that little bit of fabric. Fun fact, you can also just cut a strip of fabric yourself and sew in a little bit of that fabric tape. It's just, muslin or cotton or whatever scrap you have. You can do that on other dresses if you have problems with the fabric not being strong enough for the job and it getting a little misshapen at the seams. All right, so I'm going to inspect the work, see if there's anything that needs to be adjusted, and it was laying just fine. So now I'm opening up a little bit more at that tricky point I was talking about. This is the point that is going toward the zipper. It's the outermost point of the mesh pointing toward the zipper. We're gonna have to open that up and see what more can we machine sew. And when we run out of options there, run out of room, we're just gonna flip it and hand sew what's left. It's okay that this was not pre-basted. It's not that long of a length as long as I keep my seam allowance right and I keep the mesh from getting bumpy, it's going to be just fine. Don't forget, I'm very active in the comments here. If you have any comments or questions about this video, go ahead and put them down there. Alternative methods of sewing this are just fine. Our philosophy on this channel is there's definitely many different ways to do an alteration, and all of them are just fine as long as it results in a pretty dress in the end and a happy client, right? If you do ever have sewing questions, though, that are a little bit off topic of the video or go a little bit deeper than the video, the best way to reach me is in my Instagram DMs. That way we can actually share pictures and video clips and do voice memos and stuff. It's just an easier way for me to answer a sewing question. So you can find me on Instagram at Bridal Sewing. Also, that is my web address, bridalsewing.com. We do have digital downloads and products on there. I have a products page too. So if you're wondering What is that iron she's using? What is that steamer? What is that sewing machine? Where did she get those nippers? All of those questions are answered on the products page of my website, and that does help support my channel, and I'm super grateful. You can also leave in the comments any video requests that you may have, and I'll be happy to do those if I feel like it will enrich the community. All right, so I'm turning this right side out, checking over my sewing. Obviously, this still needs to be pressed, so I'm not going to worry about anything that will be resolved with pressing, but oh, you see that pucker? We can't leave that there, so I'm going to open that up. On this channel, those of you who follow me know that I don't just edit out things like this. This is a very important part of sewing, is going back, doing your own QC. That's quality control, and making sure you correct little things that come along. When I set out to make this channel, I wanted to make sure that it was very realistic. And moments like this are definitely realistic. They're a part of sewing. So we're going to go back through and just release that row of stitches, maybe only for an inch or so. It was not that big of a pucker. So I'll release it and just stretch that back out to get it nice and smooth and sew back over it to fix it. At this point, any other rumpling or puckering that I see, I feel like it's going to be resolved with pressing. Now it's time for the understitching. This is most often misnamed top stitching. It's not top stitching. This is the stitching that goes on the inside of the dress. This is high risk to place the dress. If you're nervous about snagging the dress, it would be best to go ahead and remove the needle while you're positioning the dress. Basically, I'm stitching the lining and the seam allowance are to the right of the needle. To the left of the needle is everything else, okay? So the outer layer of the dress, the mesh, all of that is going to be to the left of the needle. Understitching is what keeps the lining from rolling up, and it is absolutely probably the most critical part to do right on this alteration. Obviously, you don't want the mesh to be bumpy, but I guess what I'm saying is no matter how perfect you do everything else on this alteration, if you don't do understitching, the dress will not look right. It's going to look almost like what we started with, the basting stitch, how it was rolling. That would be the look that you would get without this understitching. Some people like to call it edge stitching as well. And I'm going to machine stitch this as much as I can. A lot of times it's easier, there's lower risk, and it's much faster to do it by hand. And I do it by hand a lot. But with this mesh being so finicky and all the curve, really the machine is going to be the best way to get an even stitch on this. And you'll see for parts of it, as I get closer to the zipper, and that angle is just too sharp and it's too small of an area to work, I do have to switch over to a hand stitch, and that's fine. You can see I'm running out of room. I'm at the very corner now. Yay, things are looking good so far. That's great. I've got one other trick up my sleeve. Oh, you can see where I need to hand stitch that. That's a perfect example of what it would look like without the understitching. I have one more step to this also besides the understitching that's going to prevent the rolling. It's super important, so please stay on for that detail. Again, also you can see the mesh where it's joined to that strap that swoops down. I did that same hand stitching method for the first pass that I showed you on that front, the center front V at the beginning of the video. I do have one more row of stitching to do on that is equivalent to this understitching that I'm doing, and I want to show you how I'm going to do that differently from the first example. And so here I'm just doing a basic running stitch because it's not that far of a distance that I have to go. Please note I'm doing stitch, stitch, knot. Okay? Hide the tail. This is that other step I was talking about that I'm going to do to prevent rolling. I'm going to stitch in the ditch, which is a quilter's term, but we do it quite often in the side seam for bridal, and it really helps prevent rolling. You can imagine how useful this would be, particularly if there was a piece of boning in there. So I'm just checking to make sure everything is laying smooth, and it really is. I'm very, very pleased with this. I'm just checking to make sure anywhere that we have little rumples or anything that with just a little bit of pressure, they'll roll out of the way, and that's going to let me know that it will work with the iron. All right, so for this, we're going to do just that little bit of understitching that was kind of the second layer of stitching that we did at the beginning on the centerpiece. And remember, I'm going to do a different stitch method than what I did on the first example. I just want to work in as many examples as I can. With this, I'm going to take a deeper dive into what I just said for the other parts about the stitch, stitch, knot, okay? So basically, I'm doing this with a running stitch instead of a back stitch, okay? So at that lower piece, to make it very secure, I did stitch, stitch, knot. With this one, I'm doing like 4 stitches and a knot. That knot is just going to keep the stitch from being too loose in places. I don't want the tension to be able to walk and move and adjust among the length of the whole length of the stitch, okay? So that's why I'm doing just, you know, somewhere between 2 and 5 stitches, I would say, depending on the amount of curve and whatnot. And then I'm going to stop the tension from walking with a knot. Now I'm going to spend some time at the pressing table. I really spent some time here working with the clapper, steam, and pressing. And it pressed out beautifully, as you can tell. There's that understitching. Now here it is on the bride from both sides. I was very, very happy with this. Thank you so much for watching.